Now we have an example about attack and defense, where both sides have a chance to attack and both sides have a chance or have to defend in some way. And even so, like here, white has only to take a decision between knight d4 and knight g5. This position or this decision is much harder than you may think. However, the good point is that we can be sure that after knight d4, since like our bishops are better than our opponent's bishops, especially the white bishops here, there's a clear difference, and we have better control in the center. White is better. That's a good thing about this task, because we know we have an emergency solution, which for sure is not bad. However, when knight g5 would be the winning move, or would be the move where the advantage is even greater, then why not to at least consider this move? And when we speak about knight g5, at the first glance it looks like that actually everything seems to work for white, because we have the threat of queen h5, we have the threat maybe of knight takes h7, also like we have an eye on d6, so it looks quite tempting. Here black still has two moves to decide on, or at least to choose from. One is to take on g5 and one is to take on h2. Surprisingly for me, black chose the line which in my opinion is much easier for white to cope with. He took on g5, rook takes c6, and even so, like, we didn't win any material. We just got the bishop pair. We have still two monsters on the diagonals, and we know no matter what, this position should be won. So if I was black, and at least I know that I'm losing anyway, or let's say I have a complicated situation, then at least I should go for complications and don't make it my opponent so easy. Because here the game finished in a quite easy manner. Rook d8 was played. Now a Karpov would not bother to calculate and play queen d2, and he knows that he's winning the game because the positional advantage is too huge. Or, well, an active player like the guy here with white, I'm not even sure who it was, but you will see it in the database, so it's not important, would come up with a move like h4, and you see what h4 is causing. h4 is hitting on the pawn g7 in a way that the queen needs to protect this pawn without, well, opening up black's king. So in case of queen g4, to stick to the pawn, then actually this ending is even more winning than if we had changed the queens in a different way, because the pawn structure is very bad and, well, white is just overwhelming. So that's why queen g4 is not helping the situation in the game. Queen takes h4 was played, but this allows, of course, bishop takes g7, king takes g7, and queen b2. Now queen f6 doesn't work, and the only move which black has left is king f8. And here, okay, there are a lot of possible moves. The easiest, however, in my opinion, is to watch out for mating patterns. For example, like rook f6 check is always nice in terms of the king cannot go to these squares because of my two nice diagonal pieces. So king needs to go to e7 or to 8. So all we need is a check on e5 to finish the story. And this actually leads to rook takes c6 as the easiest option. After bishop c6, rook f6, black resigned as queen e5 is coming. Okay, this was actually the very easy part. After knight g5, black took on g5, and not what actually white should be concerned about. The difficult part, and when you have a lost position from the positional point of view, then the rule is go for tactical complications, because if you don't do it, you will be outplayed. Like queen takes g5 is the wrong approach and the wrong decision when you anyway already face big problems in your positional, well, in your positional position, or in your position from the positional point of view. Okay, so after knight g5, bishop takes h2 is the only way to cause some complications, because at least we weaken a little bit white's king and we get a pawn for this sacrifice. Now, of course, here after queen takes g5, we see that at least because we have these two very strong bishops, there must be always some compensation, and the most obvious move is rook d7. And maybe black saw that move, stopped immediately and understood this is even more lost. Hard to say. Yet here, not everything is as clean as it may seem, because the thing is, after rook d7, we have also maybe some problems on the back rank, because the e5 square is very important for black. And also, like, the c1 rook is in a way important, because sometimes there are tricks with queen h4 check and some checks on c1, and this could be inconvenient. And because of all these tactical indications in this position, there is a very strong move, knight e5. And knight e5, of course, is a move you have to see in your calculation, because if you don't see it, you cannot play knight g5. And if you don't have an answer to knight e5, you can also not play knight g5. So after knight e5, the problem is that bishop takes e5 simply doesn't work because of queen h4 check and taking on c1, and well, the story is over. So that's clear. So we have to look for other alternatives, and we have quite a lot of candidate moves. We can try first to take on c8, which would help in this regard, that if black takes on c1, the bishop has to move, and then the knight is not under attack anymore. So rook takes c8 is quite a natural move to try or to calculate. Now after rook takes c8, in case of rook takes c8, the situation is easy. We can take on e5, and if you have queen h4 check, we can see that now there is still rook d1 and everything is fine. So that's why rook takes c8 is not the issue. Bishop takes c8 has to be played, because now we attack the rook. Our knight is still under attack, but if you take on e5, we take on d7. And here, after bishop takes c8, in order to prevent the idea of knight g4 and queen h4 check, we have to keep an eye on g7. Otherwise, this idea is very inconvenient for our white's king. So rook a7 should be played, and after f4, for example, the situation is far from easy, because, well, the position is quite tricky and quite complicated. Maybe black has even other moves, hard to say, but f4 is one of them, which actually makes the whole thing very unclear. So that means that we have to go back to the position after knight e5 and look for other moves. We checked rook takes c8. I think we also checked rook takes b7, or maybe we didn't check that, but the problem, as I already mentioned, is that now black can take on c1, threatening mate on h4, and after bishop takes c1, knight g4 check, and queen h4 comes the moment when you don't want to continue the calculation, because you see that there is a lot of counterplay for black, and actually nothing is very clear because the king is very weak. So that already rules out rook takes b7. So we see that we get closer and closer to the truth. So what is left? We checked rook takes c8. We checked rook takes b7. We checked even bishop takes e5. But none of this is working. We also know that one of the most dangerous threats are connected with knight g4 check, queen h4 check, and rook takes c1. So important is, whatever we do, we keep the pressure on g7, because if we don't manage this, then knight g4 is always a killing move for us. But as long the rook somehow stays on the 7th rank, or any rook stays on the 7th rank, the pressure on g7 is secured. So the first thing actually which comes to mind is rook dc7. Well, cleaning the problem about the hanging rook on d7 and also keeping the threat on g7. Here, however, like with rook dc7, you don't cause any threats because you never will be able to take on b7. And one of the easiest solutions here for black is to play rook e8. And perhaps apart from rook e8, there is also some move like knight f3 check. For example, like g takes f3. Queen h6 check, king g1, queen g6 check, and in case of king of 1, there is the pawn on f3 hanging, and also this position is far from clear because you don't have time for taking on g7 as e2 is hanging with a check. So that gets back to the situation that rook dc7 is also not good, and now we see how we eliminated all candidate moves and have only one left. We have to stick to g7, and this gets us to the move rook c1 to c7. And here we can agree latest in this moment that when you take the decision between knight g5 and knight d4, you better see knight e5 and you better see rook 1 to c7. And both these moves are very difficult to see. And that's why before you search for ages and lose a lot of time, and then you don't spot these two key moves, better to decide for a move like knight d4 at the beginning and say like, okay, we have a slight advantage and everything is fine. Here, rook cc7 is the strongest move. If you see all this, then of course you will go for knight g5, but this is not always the case. Now, in case of taking on d7, which is one candidate, then we can take back, and the issue is like that still g7 is under attack. For example, like bishop c6, I capture on g7, I take the queen, and here as one of the basic rule, if you have queen against two rooks, then it's very important to attack the king, because if you don't manage this and black consolidate, then those two rooks can be superior over the queen. And that's why just by this rule, the move g4 is quite strong, because if you take on g4, then I can take with the queen on g4, and this position is like not convenient for black's king. And if you play something like f4, I can play queen d2 with the idea of queen d4 check. If you take on e3, I take back, and also here my attack against the white's king, against the black's king is quite attractive, and in both cases white is better. But okay, a move like g4 is not so easy to see, but this is just according to the rules. Playing with queen against two rooks, make sure that your opponent's king remains weak and gets troubles. Okay, now we go back to knight takes c7 was one move. The other candidate move is rook takes c7, rook takes c7, but now the problem is that g7 is still attacked, e5 is still attacked, and the back rank is not an issue anymore. Of course, you can give one check, but such things never work as g7 is hanging. So we can see from this kind of exercise or from this game that the decision, even though we have only two moves, is very difficult to take, and it requires a lot of key moves to be found. And this is not something which is like on low level, this is an exercise on high level. And of course, like when you see this position and you decide between knight g5 and knight d4, maybe a good idea to stop the video, to look for yourself, and then to watch the video and see what eventually the right solution is. Here in this game, you cannot really decide wrongly, because knight d4 would still secure a better position. But if you are like a tough calculator and you see all the key moves like here which need to be seen, then of course you can call yourself a grandmaster or a very strong calculator, because this task was not easy at all.